There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when a lie gets exposed in public. Not the silence of shock. Not the silence of embarrassment. The silence of reckoning. I know that silence now the way I know my own breathing. Because I sat inside it on a Tuesday morning in March, in the fourth-floor conference room of Alderman and Pierce Family Law, and I watched my daughter-in-law's face go from triumphant to terrified in the space of about 4 seconds. Her name was Vanessa. Vanessa Lee Callahan, née Whitmore. 37 years old, yoga instructor turned real estate enthusiast. Married to my son Raymond for 5 years before pancreatic cancer took him from us in November. She had been smiling since we sat down. That should have told me everything I needed to know. You don't smile at a will reading the way Vanessa was smiling unless you already know exactly what's inside the envelope. My name is Dorothy Callahan. I'm 63 years old. I taught 4th grade for 28 years at Riverside Elementary in Columbus, Ohio. I raised 3 children, Raymond, my oldest, then Patricia, then Marcus, in a 4-bedroom house on Elmwood Drive that my late husband Gerald and I bought in 1989 for $82,000 and spent the next 3 decades turning into a home. That house was everything. Every birthday party, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas morning, every report card taped to the refrigerator, every midnight conversation at the kitchen table when one of my kids needed to talk. Gerald built the back porch himself. Took him 3 summers and more colorful language than I'd ever heard from a Sunday school teacher. But he built it. Gerald died of a stroke in 2018. Left the house to me free and clear. No mortgage, no complications. Just the deed in my name and 30 years of memories pressed into every wall. Raymond brought Vanessa home for the first time in the spring of 2019. She was beautiful in that carefully constructed way that takes about 2 hours every morning. Long dark hair, perfect posture, a smile that arrived precisely on cue. Raymond was 41, recently divorced from his first wife Carolyn, and absolutely certain he had found someone special. I tried to like her. I genuinely tried. I had her over for Sunday dinners. I complimented her cooking when she brought dishes to holidays. Even when the quinoa salad sat untouched at Thanksgiving because nobody in our family had ever voluntarily eaten quinoa at Thanksgiving. I bit my tongue when she referred to the house on Elmwood Drive as dated and a teardown waiting to happen. Patricia pulled me aside at Easter of 2020. "Mama," she said, her voice low, glancing toward the living room where Vanessa was showing Raymond something on her phone with great urgency. "Does Vanessa know the house is yours? Like, legally yours?" I frowned. "Of course she does. It's in my name." Patricia's expression told me she wasn't sure that mattered to Vanessa. I should have listened harder to that expression. Raymond and Vanessa married in September of 2020. Small ceremony, COVID restrictions, backyard of the Elmwood house because Vanessa said it would be charming. I remember thinking that she was looking at my yard the way a developer looks at empty land. Like she was already imagining what could be built there once the existing structure was cleared away. The changes started slowly. They always do. First it was suggestions. The kitchen could use updating. "Dorothy, have you ever thought about converting the sunroom? This neighborhood is really coming up in value, you know, if you ever wanted to sell." Then it was pressure. Raymond started talking about how I should think about downsizing now that Gerald was gone. The house was too big for one person. Too much maintenance. Wouldn't I be happier somewhere smaller? Easier, maybe a nice senior community? I was 60 years old. I was still teaching full-time and coaching the school's reading bowl team. The idea that I needed to retreat to a senior community struck me as so absurd I laughed out loud. Which did not go over well with Vanessa. Then Raymond got sick. It came fast, the way pancreatic cancer does. Diagnosis in March, gone by November. 8 months of watching my firstborn disappear in increments. And every one of those months, Vanessa positioned herself as the devoted, exhausted caretaker while systematically cutting off Raymond's access to the rest of us. Phone calls screened. Visits limited to 1 hour. Twice a week, because Raymond needed rest. Family dinners cancelled because large gatherings were too stressful for his condition. By June, I was calling my own son's cell phone and getting Vanessa's voice telling me he was resting and she'd have him call me back. He never called back. Marcus drove 4 hours from Pittsburgh in July and sat on Vanessa's porch for 2 hours before she allowed him inside for 20 minutes. Raymond was in the hospital bed they'd set up in the living room. He was thin in a way that broke Marcus's heart. And he looked at his younger brother with eyes that were trying to say something his mouth didn't have the strength to form. Marcus told me afterward that Raymond had grabbed his hand at the end of the visit and held it longer than necessary. Just held it. Not letting go. We didn't understand what he was trying to tell us until after the funeral. Raymond died on a Tuesday in November. Vanessa called me at 7 in the morning. Brief, factual, no tears in her voice. She had already notified the funeral home. She had already contacted Raymond's attorney. She was, she said, handling everything. I drove to the house on Elmwood Drive and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Inside what had been my home for 30 years. Where my son had grown up. Where his father had built the back porch with 3 summers of patient effort. Inside what Vanessa was already treating as her property. The will reading was scheduled for 3 weeks after the funeral. Patricia, Marcus, and I arrived together. The conference room at Alderman and Pierce was beige and efficient. The kind of room designed to drain the emotion out of difficult situations. A long table, leather chairs, a window overlooking the parking garage. Vanessa was already there when we arrived. She had brought her own attorney. A sharp-faced man named Griggs who set a leather briefcase on the table with the careful precision of someone who knows exactly what's inside it. Vanessa herself was dressed in tasteful black. Her hair perfect, her expression arranged into something approximating grief. And she was smiling. Not openly. Not the kind of smile you could point to and object to. Just this small, controlled curve at the corners of her mouth that said she knew exactly how this morning was going to end. I noticed her notice what I had set on the table in front of me. A large manila envelope, sealed, with my name written on the outside in handwriting I recognized as Gerald's. She glanced at it for just a second, then looked away. But that second was enough. Her attorney opened his briefcase. Raymond's estate attorney, a kind older man named Howard Pratt who I'd known for 15 years. Began the formal reading. Raymond's personal accounts, his retirement savings, his vehicle, all left to Vanessa as surviving spouse. I had expected that. That was Raymond's right to decide. Then Griggs, Vanessa's attorney, cleared his throat. He said that in addition to the will, there was a separate legal instrument that had been executed 6 months prior to Raymond's death. A deed transfer. Conveying the property at 4417 Elmwood Drive, Columbus, Ohio, to Vanessa Lee Callahan as sole owner. Patricia's hand found mine under the table. The document came sliding across that beige conference table like a snake moving through grass. Signed by Raymond. Notarized. Dated 6 months before he died. Vanessa's small smile became something wider. I know this may come as a surprise, she said, her voice smooth with practiced sympathy. Raymond wanted to ensure the family home would be protected. He and I had discussed it at length. Marcus made a sound that I put my hand on his arm to stop. Patricia was already reading the document, her face going tight with a lawyer's particular brand of controlled fury. She'd gone to law school before switching to healthcare administration. And she still read contracts the way other people breathe. I looked at Vanessa across the table. I looked at that small, satisfied smile. I looked at the document she had slid across to me like a fait accompli. Like a period at the end of a sentence she had been writing for 5 years. And I reached into my purse. I had carried the document Gerald prepared in 1991 everywhere I went for the past 4 months. Ever since a neighbor's son, a young title attorney named Ben Marsh, had knocked on my door in November, 3 days before Raymond died, to tell me he needed to speak with me urgently about something he'd discovered while reviewing property records for a client in our neighborhood. Ben had sat at my kitchen table and spread out documents. He had found an inquiry, he said. Someone had been pulling title records on the Elmwood Drive property, running searches, assessing what would be required to transfer ownership. The inquiry had come through a real estate attorney associated with one Vanessa Whitmore Callahan. He had also found the deed transfer Raymond had signed. Ben recognized immediately what I did not yet know how to see, that the signature on that deed had anomalies, inconsistencies with Raymond's known signature on other documents. The kind of inconsistencies that forensic document examiners get paid to identify. What he had also found, buried in Gerald's original estate documents from 1991, was something Vanessa had apparently missed in all her research. A trust instrument Gerald had established 30 years ago, placing the Elmwood Drive property in a family revocable trust with me as trustee and our children as beneficiaries. The deed was in my name as trustee. Not as an individual. As trustee. Which meant Raymond had no legal authority to transfer that property to anyone. Not without my signature. Not without my consent. Not without the agreement of all 3 of his siblings as beneficiaries. The deed Vanessa had just slid across that conference table was not just legally invalid. It was evidence of fraud. I set the envelope on the table. I unfolded the trust documents Gerald had signed 30 years ago. The ones Ben had certified and had reviewed by 2 additional title attorneys who both confirmed the same conclusion. And I slid them across the table toward Griggs. That deed your client has presented is worthless, I said. My voice was very calm. I had practiced calm for 4 months. Because the Elmwood Drive property has been held in a family trust since 1991. And Raymond had no authority to convey it to anyone. Furthermore, the signature on that deed has already been reviewed by a forensic document examiner retained by my attorney. I paused. And honey, forgery is a federal crime. The silence that fell over that conference room was the one I mentioned at the beginning of this story. The silence of reckoning. Vanessa's smile disappeared so completely it was like watching someone turn off a light. Her face went through 4 different expressions in about 3 seconds. Confusion, then recalculation, then a flash of something that looked almost like fear, and then the careful blankness of someone who has been caught and knows it and is deciding how to manage the next 60 seconds. Howard Pratt, Raymond's estate attorney, had gone very still. He was reading the trust documents I had provided. I watched his face as he understood what he was looking at. And he set the papers down with the careful deliberateness of a man who wants to choose his next words precisely. Griggs, Vanessa's attorney, opened his briefcase again. Closed it. Opened it again. He was reviewing something on his phone. I noticed his jaw tighten. Patricia leaned close to my ear. Mama, she whispered, barely above a breath. There's a man sitting in the back of the room. I nodded. Marcus had noticed him too. A quiet man in a gray suit who had slipped into the conference room just before we started and taken a seat against the back wall without introducing himself. He had a yellow legal pad on his knee and had been writing on it steadily since Griggs began speaking. His name was Detective Carl Whitmore. No relation to Vanessa. He worked financial crimes for the Columbus Police Department. Ben Marsh and I had contacted him 6 weeks ago. I had invited him to sit in the back of the room. Griggs stood up from the table. I'll be honest, I did not expect that to happen. But looking back, I should have. He was a competent attorney. He understood the moment the trust documents hit the table exactly what his client had done and exactly what his professional obligations were going to be. Mrs. Callahan, I need to step out and make a call, he said, addressing Vanessa. His voice was neutral in a way that told me he was already distancing himself from what was about to happen. Vanessa looked at him with the desperation of a person watching their getaway car drive away. He walked out. And the door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Let me tell you something about that moment. For 4 months, I had been carrying the weight of what I suspected Vanessa had done. 4 months of sleepless nights and careful documentation and conversations with attorneys and document examiners and a detective who kept telling me to be patient. To let the evidence build. To not tip my hand before the moment was right. 4 months of watching my family grieve Raymond while simultaneously preparing for the fight his wife had decided to pick with us. And in that moment, watching Griggs walk out, watching Vanessa's perfectly maintained composure finally crack along the edges like old paint in a heat wave, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, exactly. Nothing that felt good in a clean way. Just truth, finally sitting where it belonged. Vanessa, Howard Pratt said gently. He was a kind man who had known Raymond since he was 32 years old. I think you should call someone. A family member, or another attorney. Before this conversation continues. She looked at me across the table. Whatever she had expected this morning to look like. It wasn't this. How? She said. Just that one word. Not a denial. Just, how? I thought about Raymond grabbing Marcus's hand in that hospital bed living room and not letting go. I thought about all the phone calls that never got returned. I thought about Gerald building the back porch with 3 summers of patient effort. Plank by plank, because he wanted his children to have a place to gather for the rest of his life and long after. Because your husband loved his family, I said. And Gerald Callahan loved his family enough to plan 30 years ahead. And because I taught school for 28 years. Vanessa. And the one thing you learn teaching 4th grade is that the children who are most certain they've gotten away with something are almost always the ones who forgot to check their work. Detective Whitmore stood up from his chair in the back of the room. What followed were weeks of investigation, legal filings, and the kind of institutional process that grinds slowly and without drama. The forensic document examiner's report confirmed what Ben Marsh had suspected. The deed transfer bore Raymond's signature reproduced in a manner inconsistent with his own signing patterns. Particularly notable given the advanced state of his illness during the period when the document was purportedly executed. Additional examination of Raymond's medical records from that period showed that in the weeks surrounding the notarization date on the deed, he had been on medication levels that his oncologist stated would have made him incapable of executing legal documents with full cognitive capacity. Vanessa's own phone records and email correspondence told a story she had apparently never expected anyone to read. The charges that resulted were significant. Document fraud, elder financial exploitation, and several counts related to the deliberate isolation of Raymond from his family during his final months. Actions that prosecutors argued were part of a pattern of coercive control designed to facilitate the theft of estate assets. Griggs, to his credit, cooperated fully with investigators once he understood the scope of what his client had done. He had apparently been deceived about the deed's legitimacy when he agreed to represent Vanessa's interests. The Elmwood Drive property remained in the family trust. I want to tell you something about the months that followed. Patricia, Marcus, and I gathered at the house on Elmwood Drive the first Sunday in April, the first warm weekend of spring. Marcus drove up from Pittsburgh with his wife and their 2 kids. Patricia brought her husband and a casserole dish she'd been making since college. I made Gerald's banana pudding from memory. The same recipe I've been making since 1987. We sat on the back porch Gerald built with 3 summers of patient effort. And we ate, and we talked about Raymond. Not about Vanessa, not about what had happened in that conference room. About Raymond. About the boy who used to climb that oak tree until Gerald made him stop. About the teenager who played guitar badly and with tremendous enthusiasm. About the man who had grabbed his brother's hand in a hospital bed living room and held on because there was something he needed to say that he couldn't find the words for. Marcus thought he had been trying to warn us. I chose to believe he had been saying goodbye the way people say goodbye when they're out of time. Just by holding on a little longer than necessary. Some things you decide to believe because the alternative is too heavy to carry. The oak tree in the backyard was budding that afternoon. The porch railing needed painting. The same as it always does by spring. The yard smelled like thawed earth and coming warmth. My grandson, Marcus's 9-year-old, asked me if he could climb the oak tree. I told him only to the second branch. He climbed to the third. I let it go. Some rules are worth enforcing and some things are just boys being exactly what they're supposed to be. I retired from Riverside Elementary the following June. 28 years of 4th grade. 4 Reading Bowl championships. And more children than I can count who came back years later to tell me that something I'd said had mattered. That's the thing about teaching that nobody tells you going in. You plant seeds in the dark and sometimes, 20 years later, someone knocks on your classroom door and shows you what grew. I spend my mornings now on that back porch with coffee and whatever novel I'm working through. I volunteer twice a week at the elementary school literacy program 2 blocks over. Patricia comes for Sunday dinner every other week. Marcus drives up every other month. The grandchildren know which branch they're allowed to climb. And they always climb one higher. And I always let it go. The house smells like banana pudding and old wood and the particular scent of a home that has been loved for a very long time. Gerald built it right. He always did. There's a drawer in the kitchen where I keep a photograph of Raymond taken the summer he was 12. He's sitting on the porch railing, the one Gerald hadn't finished painting yet, squinting into the afternoon sun with this expression that says he's simultaneously delighted to be alive and mildly irritated about something. Exactly the expression he kept his whole life. I talk to that photograph sometimes. Not every day. But sometimes. I tell him the porch railing needs painting again. I tell him the oak tree survived another winter. I tell him his brother came up last month and sat in Gerald's old chair and looked exactly like him for a moment in the late afternoon light. I tell him the house is still here. It's still ours. It's still exactly what his father built it to be. And I think, wherever Raymond is, he knows that. I think that was always what he was trying to say. And that was the story of 4417 Elmwood Drive. But I want you to know what happened afterward. 3 months later, when Vanessa's defense team made a claim that nobody in that courtroom saw coming. That is a story all its own. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.